I'm Varn with UCAN. Thanks for all of you guys for joining us. I'm here today to talk about fueling and fueling smarter with UCAN. And we're joined by a wonderful, very experienced guest. We've got Charlotte Werner, registered dietitian, who is here with us. Charlotte has a whole host of experience working in sports nutrition, working as a registered dietitian, and she's also quite an accomplished endurance athlete herself. She's got, as you can see here on the screen, over 7 years of experience, specializing in GI disease, pediatric nutrition, weight management, and sport nutrition. So she's not only worked with athletes, but she's worked with a whole host of individuals to optimize their health and their fitness. She's the founder of a virtual endurance nutrition private practice and consulting company. She works with runners as well as other endurance athletes and really spans the gamut of all levels of running. So if you're on here today as a beginner or you're super experienced as an endurance athlete, the wonderful thing is Charlotte's experience kind of spans the gamut. So you'll hear something that interests you. And finally, she's an ultra runner and a marathoner training for a 100 miler Keys 100 coming up here pretty soon, right, Charlotte?
Oh yeah, I don't know why I keep doing this to myself, but I find myself at the start line of 100 milers far too often.
So Charlotte has lived the pain that a lot of you all have felt before. I know we've got both runners and triathletes in the audience. So Charlotte's experience with the ultra endurance stuff, also fast, sub 3 hour marathoner, very impressive. So really, really thrilled, Charlotte, to have you here. This session is going to be really valuable, like I mentioned, to people whose kind of experience with fueling spans the whole spectrum, whether you're a beginner or really experienced practicing your fueling. We're going to get into certainly the specifics of UCAN and how to use the various UCAN products in your training, but we're also going to talk about nutrition theory and sort of some of the basics of fueling that you should pay attention and follow just in general. So you'll have the theory behind great fueling, and then we'll talk about how UCAN fits in. Charlotte, with that, I am going to turn it over to you. And if anybody here, for those who are joining us live, we really appreciate it today. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat. We want to make this as interactive as we can. If you have questions for Charlotte, fire away. We'll answer them either, in real time on the flow if they it makes sense, or certainly at the end. And everybody who has signed up here and is with us in attendance, you'll get a full recording. So you can listen now, but you'll also have a chance to reference back to this later. Charlotte, with that, I will kick it over to you.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about all things nutrition, but specifically how nutrition relates to UCAN and the importance of this product and how it can benefit you as an athlete. So, in terms of our agenda for today, we're going to talk through a few different things. We're going to start off just talking about UCAN's patented supercarb, also known as Live Steady. You may have heard both terms in the past. We're also going to talk through the product lines. UCAN's product lines are rapidly expanding, and I want to make sure that there's an understanding of what the offerings are and how they can best support you as an athlete. We'll talk a little bit about blood sugar and gut tolerance to give you a little bit more of the science behind the product and why and how it can benefit you as well, and what things you need to know from that perspective. Then we'll go into athlete consideration. So as Varun mentioned, we're going to not just talk about UCAN, but how you should typically try to fuel and how you should typically try to hydrate during any sort of race or training session that you're doing, and then also how UCAN can fit into that. And then we'll also go through some common questions. So whether it's a question that comes up from the chat or some questions that we already have pre-prepared, we'll make sure we do a bit of both to answer any and all questions that you guys may have in the space. So to get us started, I want to first talk about UCAN Supercarb and what it actually is, because it differs to every other carbohydrate on the market. And for me personally, I think it's really special because of that. I'm also a huge nutrition nerd, so I love science and I love being able to look at the research and actually see sort of what's going on and the why. Now, UCAN's story, I think, really tells the story of this supercarb. And what I mean by that is UCAN actually started in the medical space. The supercarb was developed to help and support individuals who have something called glycogen storage disease. Now, this is a disease where these individuals can't actively process and utilize glycogen the way individuals who don't have glycogen storage disease can. Now, why this is important, if you're not familiar with glycogen as a whole, glycogen is your storage of carbohydrate in your body. So if you can't actively sort of tap into that, that's going to make it a lot harder for you to keep your blood sugar stable, especially when you think about nighttime. Now, for these individuals, they had a lot of trouble, especially throughout the night, maintaining their blood sugar. And their blood sugar can drop in some cases so low that it can ultimately lead to death if they're not sort of staying on top of it. So it's a very serious condition and one that needs to be managed with some precision. Now, the reason why UCAN was developed to support that is because it will help with steady energy and it will help with consistent energy to ensure that throughout the night, these individuals maintain a steady and stable blood sugar. And the reason for that is the way that the starch, so UCAN is actually made from a starch, not a sugar. So think about things like glucose and fructose, that's not where UCAN sits. It actually sits in the complex carbohydrate category. But the way it's processed, in some ways, it kind of behaves a little bit like a simple sugar in terms of being easy to digest, but it's steady releasing. So that allows you to pull from it for longer and maintain that steady blood sugar for longer as well. Which, when you then take it out of the medical space and think about the other applications, I mean, the applications are tremendous, right? Especially when we think about the endurance world as well and what we can utilize this for as athletes when we're trying to find ways to maintain our blood sugar and keep us steady so we can keep pushing for longer and harder, right? To support the performance that we're doing. Now, before we dive any further into the science, I want to talk a little bit about the product line because UCAN's product lines are expanding, like I mentioned, rapidly. So, first, we've got our gels. Now, gels are something that you can either use, and I talk to my clients a lot about gels as something that you can have quick right before you get started, but it's also something that you're going to rely on as you go during exercise. So, there's the original gel line, and this is going to be that Live Steady or the super carb. And there's minimal sodium in there. So this is something that you're going to want to have with electrolytes accompanying it and water accompanying it to help absorb those electrolytes and maintain fluid balance. The next is going to be the gel plus caffeine. Now, this contains that Live Steady carb plus caffeine to support those who want a little bit of a boost from the caffeine side as well. Next is my personal current favorite, which is the Gel Plus Electrolyte line. This is our newest line, and this contains that Live Steady Carb plus 200 milligrams of sodium per serving. So if you're looking for more of that all-in-one solution when it comes to your carb source plus your electrolytes, this is going to be something that you should look to and may want to rely on during a race. You do want to make sure you're also consuming water, not necessarily for the carb, even though carbs do need water to be digested, but because of the electrolytes in here. Because of the electrolytes, you want to make sure you're balancing out your fluids and getting in enough to support what you're losing. So you take your electrolyte gel and you have your fluids and it's all set and ready to go for you. The next is going to be the energy powder. Now, cran raspberry, I put it up here because it was my favorite up until about 6 hours ago when it changed to the lemon flavor. I tried the lemon flavor for the first time today and it is incredible. So if you have not tried it, I would highly recommend giving it a look. But the UCAN energy powder is something that you would put in water. You can have it either pre-exercise or during to support you throughout your efforts. I typically like to bring a bottle with me if I'm on a treadmill because I have easy access. So for me, this is something that's perfect for those days where I'm doing long miles on the treadmill. And it's something that also, similar to the Gel Plus Electrolytes, contains both the Live Steady Carb plus the electrolytes. It's got a slightly lower amount of sodium, roughly about 170 milligrams per serving, flavor dependent. But that's going to be another product to consider if you're also someone who carries bottles, whether it's during a run or a ride in the case of triathlons. The next that I want to talk about briefly is still within this energy sort of powder category, but it's the unflavored. Now, this does not contain any sodium in here, but it is strictly the Live Steady carbohydrate. And this is something that will allow you to individualize your fueling strategy to meet your needs. And what I mean by that is if you want to add this to a bottle during a ride or a run and add your own personal favorite hydration mix, you can totally do that. If you want to add this to a smoothie post exercise or post race to support restoration of glycogen and maintaining your blood sugar, this is something else that you can also add and it won't add that flavor if you don't want it to. So I always like to point this one out as well because it's something that I don't think we utilize enough. Now, in addition, there's also a protein plus energy line. So similar to what I was just mentioning with the unflavored energy powder, this is going to be very similar, except it's going to be flavored. It's going to be something that you'd have post-workout, and it also contains protein in there to further support you in addition to the Live Steady carbohydrate. Next is going to be our hydrate line. The hydrate line does not contain any carbohydrate. It is strictly going to be for your electrolytes. So if you want to make a mix of the UCAN Energy plus hydrate, you can totally do that and sort of create your own little mix from there too. And last but certainly not least is the bars. The bars are something that you can have before or after is where I would typically recommend it. Simply because energy bars are going to take longer to digest. They're going to be a little bit harder as they go through the system. They're not necessarily going to be something that will sit in there very long because it does have the Live Steady carbohydrate in there. But from a mechanical digestion standpoint, which starts with chewing, it can sometimes be very hard to chew when you're running or you're cycling. So we want to make sure that this is something that we either keep pre or post, unless you are someone who does enjoy chewing as you run or ride and you're able to do it pretty easily. Now, if you do have this post workout, I would also recommend just trying to have a side of additional protein just to give you that little extra bump, because this is going to be mainly carbs and just a small amount of protein to further support you, which makes it perfect for pre-exercise or pre-race. And now we get into the good stuff. So this is the stuff that I love to talk about, which is the science behind the product. And first, I want to talk a little bit about blood sugar and energy and why it's important that we maintain our blood sugar throughout our efforts, and why it's important that we understand what this means for us and how different forms of carbohydrate affect our blood sugar. So to start, again, I just want to reiterate first and foremost that UCAN's carbohydrate, the Live Steady or the super carb, is different to every other source of carbohydrate on the market. And it's not glucose, it's not fructose, it's not maltodextrin, it is that starch. So as a result, because of the way it's processed as well, it's going to behave differently. Now, I want you to turn your attention to the right side of this screen, where you see in the top here. This was a study that was conducted in 2010 on 9 cyclists. These are highly trained cyclists. And they were given a dose of either maltodextrin or UCAN's supercarb before they started riding. It was roughly 15 to 30 minutes before. Now, before sort of explaining this graph further, I'm going to just do a little bit of explaining of insulin and what insulin is, because I think it tells the story of why this supercarb behaves differently and how it can support you. The first thing to know about insulin is it's a hormone that your body produces, and it helps you deliver glucose into your cells so you can utilize it for energy. But it is also something that when it goes high in our system, it sort of shuts off our body's ability to use fat as well as we want to. Not completely, but it just dims it quite a bit. So ideally, as an endurance athlete, especially when we're pushing hard for a long duration, we want to be able to pull from our fat stores as well. We don't want it to be the main thing we pull from because it's not as efficient, but we want to be able to utilize it in addition to our glycogen, which is our carbohydrate stores, and what we're taking in actively as we exercise, which is going to be what we find in our blood sugar. So when you think about this and you think about how insulin works and it shuts off that sort of fat oxidation or your body's ability to use fat as energy, if we see a big spike in insulin, that's not going to be something that we necessarily want right as we're getting started in our workout. Not only because of how it shuts that off, but that also means that glucose has been delivered into our cell and our blood sugar is going to start to plummet. So the first thing I want you to see is this blue line here is going to be maltodextrin. So it goes up and then it comes down pretty rapidly. The red line down here, if you can see my mouse, is going to be Live Steady or UCAN supercarb. And you can see that this has a much lower response with the same amount of carbohydrate. So they were given the same amount of carb. It's just either maltodextrin, which is fast acting, or UCAN supercarb. Now, why that's important is because you can still then, if you're taking UCAN supercarb, utilize fat for energy in addition to glycogen and to what you're taking in as you go, which is awesome. Now, in addition to that, because there's not this high, high and low, low in your insulin, if you look down here at the bottom graph, you'll see that these open dots, so the open dots with the dotted line, it's going to also be maltodextrin. And you can see that it goes up, then it comes down, right? Similar to how insulin went up, then it came down. With UCAN's supercarb, it's a slightly lower process, right? Where it's steady up and steady down, which is exactly what you'd want to see as an endurance athlete because you don't want to be chasing the high and trying to run away from the low with more consistent energy. So you're able to utilize multiple sources of energy as you exercise, which will ultimately allow you to push harder for longer and not necessarily just rely on carbohydrate alone to get you there, right? You're able to pull from multiple sources, which is awesome. This is not to say that you shouldn't be fueling as you go, and it's not to say that we won't want to take in more carbs, but it is to say that this process will allow you to be more efficient as an athlete. Now, in addition to that, when we also look at the recovery space, the same thing is true, right? We see the high, high, and then the drop, the high, high, and then the drop. With UCAN, it's a little bit more steady. So post workout, you also may benefit from taking in something like UCAN Super Carb to give you that steady energy as you continue on with your day and allow you to recover well without any sort of crash occurring. The next is going to be gut tolerance. So, GI tolerance is something that comes up a lot with athletes. We've all been there where we've had to either run to the bathroom or we felt sort of that gurgliness or maybe some like pulling or some cramping, and it just doesn't feel good, right? We want to try to avoid that as much as possible. And I always say to my athletes when we're thinking about endurance, it's all about risk. If you tolerate something well and it sits well in your stomach and you've used it multiple times, that's going to be low risk for you. If you've never tried something before, if you try it for the first time on race day, that's going to be a higher risk for you. And that's going to be something that we want to consider. With UCAN's Super Carb, it's going to be a lower risk product when you're trying and training from a gut tolerance perspective because of the way that the Super Carb works, but also because of the actual structure of the Super Carb and how it moves through the system. So first, I want to talk a little bit about traditional carbohydrates, so glucose, fructose, maltodextrin, and the like. They're going to be fast acting. They enter your system quickly, you have available access to them quickly, and they're really helpful as endurance athletes because of that. But you have to fuel really consistently in order to ensure that you have that available. So you might be fueling every 20 minutes, you might be fueling every 30 minutes. Maybe some people are fueling every 45 with most traditional gels, but it's usually at a bit of a quicker cadence because you're burning through it a lot faster. And again, you're seeing the high, high and the low, low happen as you exercise. With UCAN Super Carb, you see here, which is the green, that it's a bit more of a stable line. Now, why that's important when we also think about gut tolerance is because of how it's moving through the system. With UCAN Super Carb, it's going to empty the stomach pretty quickly, which is what you want. The more that carbohydrates sit in the stomach, the more risk that you have of them fermenting. And that can then lead to things like gas and bloating and cramping and all the things that we want to avoid as endurance athletes. But in addition to that, it then sort of slowly continues to drip into your system from there, allowing you to again utilize it without needing to refuel as much or as often. Now, this is not to say that you can't. I personally still fuel almost just as often, but I'm able to get in more with less of a risk, which is awesome too. Now, in addition to that, carbs need water to be digested. Carbohydrates and water have this wonderful relationship where when you take in carbs, you need some water to help pull them in and actively digest them. But then when you store carbohydrates as glycogen, you also need more water. When you store carbs as glycogen, every gram of carbohydrate is stored with 3 to 4 grams of water. So it really just highlights that relationship, right, and how closely they work together. Now, why this is important is because when we think about being an athlete and going for long durations, if we're taking in tons and tons of carbs every hour, we're going to also need more water to support that. And that's going to be something else that you want to make sure you're factoring into the equation. But if we have something that's going to give us more steady sort of drips of carbohydrate, we're able to moderate our fluids a little bit more and our GI can handle it a little bit better as a result. So there's a lower risk of you feeling that pull or that cramping when dehydration inevitably sets in any sort of race. No matter how good we are at sort of rehydrating throughout, we're going to end up slightly dehydrated to some degree. So having something that will complement that, right, and allow us to continue to push without sort of having this high risk of that carbohydrate pulling in more water, that's going to be a win-win for you. And that's going to be something that potentially UCAN can support you with. Now, in addition to that, a lot of times you might also hear the terminology of training the gut, which essentially means you're training the gut to allow you to take in more carbs, digest them properly, and absorb them as you go and as you're exercising. Because when you exercise, blood flow is diverted away from the GI to things like your working muscles, your heart, your brain, etc. And then if you sort of take that one step further and you think about when it gets hot, you also have blood flow being rediverted to your skin surface to cool you down. So that's why, especially in the heat, you may feel like you're having more gut distress because there's even less blood flow occurring in the GI to allow you to move things through. So when we have a higher carbohydrate load coming in, it can make it hard for the GI to actively process that. And so we train the gut to keep some of that blood flow in there and to process it the way it should as you're exercising. Now, with UCAN Super Carb, where this can come in and really support you is that it's not going to sit in the stomach quite as long and ferment. It's going to pass through and it's going to digest slowly, which gives the body a little more time to digest it and actively absorb it rather than having to do all that work right away, which is what you can see sort of with the high and the drop of a traditional carbohydrate like maltodextrin, which is what this one was. Now, as a result, ultimately, it's going to be easier on the stomach. This does not mean that you need to have only UCAN. I work with some athletes who use UCAN in conjunction with other products, and that can be another way that you sort of add it to your routine. And that's something that I also do, where I have UCAN as my base, giving me that steady in the background. And then when I need quick hits along the way, that's where I can take more quick hits if I need them. But having that steady base in the background and having that lower insulin spike allows you to be more efficient with the energy that you already have on board too. And it allows you to change up your fueling if you want to. You may not need quite as much because it's going to give you more steady energy and stable energy over time, which will mean that you need to carry less over the course of a race. And if you're like me and you're already carrying like 1,000 things, having to carry a few less gels might be a win for you, but you might also still prefer to fuel at the same level. And if that's you, you can try that. I would encourage you to try UCAN both as a one-to-one, where you swap it out for traditional carbohydrates, and then also as just part of your routine. Maybe have one at the start and one halfway through and see how you feel. And that's the beauty of this product, is that it can help you in multiple ways, depending on what you're looking to accomplish and depending on how you feel as you exercise. Similar to people who enjoy caffeine versus who don't, right? This product can give you that boost if you want it to, but it can be something you rely on solely or something that you have in the background giving you that steady base, which is a beautiful thing. Now, when we think about nutrition considerations for athletes and how we can use it, we're going to talk a little bit about carbohydrates for endurance and how often we want to be taking them. So I alluded to some of that before. Some options you need to fuel with more frequently because of the high and the low. You want to catch that low. Other products like you can fuel a little bit less often if you want to, because you have more of that steady and stable flow of energy. So if you're traditionally fueling maybe every 30 minutes, maybe you can fuel every 45 minutes with UCAN because you get more of that steady and accessible energy, as an example. Then we'll talk about fluids and electrolytes, which I think are a huge topic right now, as well as protein post-exercise and some considerations there when it comes to carbohydrates as well. So the first thing to chat through is fueling. Now, if we're going for an hour or less, you can take a gel maybe 10 to 20 minutes before the start, and that will get you through that workout because it's going to give you that boost right as you get started, and then it will continue to give you stable energy as you go. If you're using more of a traditional carbohydrate, you might want to push that up a little bit more, closer to right when you get started because of that insulin spike. With UCAN, you can take it a little bit further out. It won't provide that insulin spike and crash. So as you get started, you're not going to feel like you're out of energy. With a traditional gel, you might want to take it closer to like 10 minutes before, just so that when that insulin spike happens, you're not seeing that big decline right as you get going, because that's going to make you feel like you don't have energy, and that's not what you want. Then when we start to think about going for over an hour, that's where we start to think about what we need to take with us fueling wise. And it's really important to make sure that you're fueling your body for the effort and the duration. Because if you're not, it's going to lead to more inflammation and more cortisol being produced as a stress response. And we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. And that's the other ultimate goal of fueling as you go, is to reduce that inflammation, reduce that cortisol response, and allow you to continue doing what you love every single day without feeling like your body is sort of seeing a decline in recovery. Fueling during those workouts is going to be pivotal to keeping sort of that excess fatigue away. So when it comes to over an hour in duration, the sort of degree to which you fuel is going to vary a lot by person. It can be anywhere from 30 to 90 grams per hour. Now, if you've never fueled before, I'd recommend starting with a gel every 45 to 60 minutes, depending on what feels good to you. Start there, see how you feel. If it feels good, if you're feeling like, oh, this feels like I could probably take in a little bit more, push it another 15 minutes, see how it feels. But do this slowly and gradually. So start with a week of every 45 minutes as an example first. If that feels good, the next week, try every 30 minutes, see how you feel. If that feels good to you and you're like, I don't think I can get in much more than this, then stay there for a little bit and see how you feel. That might be anywhere from 40 to 60 grams of carbs if you're doing it every 30 minutes. There's some gels that are also closer to 40 grams in a gel, so they may give you a little bit more, closer to 80 grams per hour. But again, everyone's needs differ. And if you're also introducing a product like UCAN, it's going to give you that stable energy for longer. So you may not need to fuel with quite as much, which will allow you to keep your blood sugar stable. It will allow you not to have those high highs and low lows in your insulin response. And it will allow you to also pull from fat, which is another source of energy. Again, it's not going to be the thing we want to pull from entirely because it's not as efficient, but it is something that if we have access to it, we might as well also pull from that too, right? And that's the sort of beauty, like I mentioned, of a product like UCAN that doesn't provoke that same insulin response. And then from there, you want to keep your fueling consistent. So if you're doing every 30 minutes, try to maintain every 30. If you're doing every 40 minutes or 45, try to maintain that for the duration of the effort and try it in multiple settings. So don't just try your fueling strategy in a long, easy run. Make sure you're also giving it a go in a hard tempo effort or maybe a track workout because you want to see how your GI responds in different scenarios. As I mentioned before when talking about gut tolerance, blood flow gets diverted away from the GI during exercise. During higher intensity exercise, even more blood flow gets diverted away. So we want to make sure that when you have this intense and extreme effort, that your body also still handles the load of carbohydrate that you're taking in. And that's going to make you be able to perform at a higher level, push harder for longer, and maintain it as well. And like I mentioned with UCAN specifically, because of how easy it is on the GI, it is something that you are likely going to be able to tolerate in both scenarios without any issues, which is awesome. Now, in terms of hydration, like I mentioned, hydration is a huge topic at the moment. And sodium is sort of the one thing that we are all talking about. Now, I want to talk a little bit here about why sodium tends to come up a lot. And the main reason for this is because aside from fluids, sodium is going to be the main thing that you're losing in your sweat, the main electrolyte component. As a result, you want to make sure you're replenishing as you go. But you want to make sure you have enough fluids first as you're sort of replenishing to guide your body and to optimize fluid balance. If you're only taking in sodium and you're not replenishing your fluids, your sodium concentration in your blood goes up. And it can actually cause similar symptoms to when you have too little sodium and too much water, like nausea and sort of like feeling like extreme fatigue. And so we want to make sure that we're balancing both our fluids and our electrolytes together. So if you're going under an hour, ideally you just need water. Similar to when you're going under an hour for fueling, if you can get a gel 10 to 15 minutes beforehand, if it's UCAN, or right as you get going, if it's any other gel, that's going to be something that will support you through that effort. And you likely don't need much more than that fueling wise. The same thing can be said for hydration. You can bring a bottle of water with you, especially if you're exercising in the heat and we're heading into the warmer months. So it's something I would definitely recommend, but you likely don't need much more than that unless you're doing a really hard effort. You're going to be in the hot, hot sun. We may then consider a little bit of electrolytes, but water will be your best friend in this case, sipping over the course of that hour too. So you never want to be gulping down lots of fluids as you exercise because you will get this sloshy feeling. Like I mentioned, the gut is going to be a very sensitive environment as you're exercising because blood flow has been diverted away. So it's not working at its highest level. And as a result, if lots of fluid gets dumped in at once, it causes that sloshy feeling, and it can also lead to additional GI distress. Again, increasing that risk. And I like to think about the entirety of endurance and the puzzle that it is as sort of a game of risk in a lot of ways, right? And how can we minimize risk? How can we show up to the line of any race or training session knowing that things may not all go perfectly? And that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to know that there are risks, that we know how to handle them when they arise, when things might go a little sideways, and that we know what our body's telling us in those moments too. And we've done what we can to minimize risk as well. And this will be one of them, which is sipping over the course of the hour rather than taking larger gulps. I typically tell my athletes to start just practicing sipping every 10 or so minutes and just see how you feel rather than focusing on a specific amount first. Once you get into a good rhythm, taking a couple sips every 10 minutes, then we can start to think about, okay, how much are you actually getting in? And what is our actual goal for you? Are you a heavy sweater? Are you a salty sweater? What kinds of conditions are you in? Are you at altitude? Is it hot? Is it humid? What are all the other pieces we need to consider? And that brings me to the over hour sort of exercise duration. If you're going for over an hour in duration, and again, it will vary based on temperature, humidity, altitude, your specific needs, and whether you're a heavy or salty sweater. But generally speaking, I like to start athletes around 300 to 600 milligrams of sodium per hour, alongside 12 to 16 ounces of water per hour, and making sure that we're sipping consistently over the course of each hour. Now, if you use something like UCAN's electrolyte gel plus the UCAN electrolyte gel, you're going to see that it has 200 milligrams of sodium in there. So if you're doing one every 30 minutes, you're going to be right at smack in the middle of that 300 to 600 milligram range. And all you need to do is sip on that water every 10 minutes to get you close to that 12 to 16 ounce mark. So again, it really simplifies your strategy. But if you are someone who likes to carry a bottle, I know plenty of athletes that do. I do as well sometimes like to carry a bottle with me, especially of ice cold water that will allow me to not have to stop at fountains along the way or plan my route around that, or plan my route around sort of where I can put my bottle that I know it's going to be safe. This is going to be something that you can also use, which is like a hydrate product, and you can put it in your bottle. But again, it comes down to your individual needs and your preferences and what you ultimately enjoy. More than anything else, know that every single athlete's needs are different. I do not have a single two athletes that I work with that have the same strategy. And that really shows how beautiful the sport is too, because it's so incredibly individualized. So keep tinkering with your strategy, find what works for you, and continue from there. I also play around with mixing my gels together sometimes because I also find that fun, right? Where I can maybe see how two different flavors interact with each other. Sometimes I've been known to do it. I was telling Varun about this the other day. The cherry electrolyte with the sort of neutral or unflavored gel, I put them together and I put them in a soft flask, and I really enjoy it. And that allows me to then also take a bottle with some electrolytes too. So again, the options are endless and vast. And that's the beauty of this too, is that you can really mix and match it to your specific preferences. But ultimately, aiming for these sort of to start will be a really good option for you, especially if you've never had your sort of sweat rate tested before and you're not really sure where to begin. Start here. If you're a heavy or salty sweater, maybe start towards the higher end of the sodium range, or maybe right in the middle to higher. And then fluids wise, start on the higher end of that range. If you feel like you sweat pretty normally to people around you, you don't ever have like white streaks on your face or on your clothes after you finish a workout, maybe start at the lower end of the ranges and see how you do first, and then progress from there. But again, we start with building that consistency with just getting in fluids every 10 or so minutes, and then we go from there. And now the really exciting part, which is talking about how to build sort of a race day fueling strategy. And you can also use the same strategy when you're thinking about training. So ideally, 2 to 3 hours before, you're going to want to have your usual breakfast. And if you're going to use UCAN, you also want to add in the UCAN energy powder, because this is going to help, again, give you additional carbohydrates, but also give you that steady energy in the background, which is exactly what you're going to want to need. And then roughly 15 minutes before the start, that's when you have that first gel. The UCAN energy gel, you can take it 15 minutes before because you're not going to get that spike of insulin in the crash. And that's going to be something that will give you a little bit of a top up of your carbohydrate needs before you get going. But roughly 2 to 3 hours before is where you want to have that breakfast. Make sure the breakfast has minimal fiber, minimal fats, a little bit of protein, lots of carbs. The reason being that fiber and fat are also harder to digest. I always say that like pre-race breakfast and like dinner, sort of the day before a race, are the opposite of traditional nutrition advice, because we want it to be easy on the stomach and easy to digest, because there's going to be minimal blood flow, right, as we're exercising. And if something takes a lot of mechanical digestion, and we don't have the blood flow to support it, it's going to cause GI distress. And fiber and fats take longer to digest and they take more work or that mechanical digestion to digest. So we want to make sure we're just minimizing those in the breakfast that we choose to allow us to push hard for long without having any sort of higher risk of GI distress as a result. During the race, something like UCAN's energy gel every 30 to 60 minutes is going to be an option that may work really well for you. And again, it's going to be varied by person. You might do every 30 minutes, you might do every 45. I have some athletes that do every 20 minutes, and then I have some that do every hour. It really depends on the person and what you're doing as well. If you're going at a high intensity, we're going to need more to support us, especially more carbs, because we're burning through more of them as we go. If it's an easier intensity, we pull a little bit more from fat in that case. So we can have our carbs. We can use something like UCAN, which will allow us to pull from our fat stores more efficiently, and we can do it a little less often. So think about the intensity levels of the work that you're doing too, but always practice in training at least 2 to 3 times your race day strategy on both a long run and a tempo-based workout because you want to make sure that you tolerate it in both of those scenarios. So 2 to 3 easy runs that are long and 2 to 3 more like track-based or tempo-based workouts where you see how you actually respond when you're taking in your fuel at the rate that you will be during your race. And then obviously, in addition to that, as mentioned at the bottom, you also want to make sure that you're getting in water and or an electrolyte beverage, depending on the gel that you're using. Again, as a reminder, the original line does not contain electrolytes. So if you're a fan of my personal favorite, the pineapple, that one doesn't have any electrolytes in there. So you just want to make sure that you're supporting that with either an electrolyte beverage or some sort of tablets that will give you additional electrolytes as you go with your fluids. And then lastly, but certainly not least, once the hard work is done, whether it's in training or on race day, you want to think about post-race. Post-race, it is still important to get in more carbs because you need to replenish the tank, as well as protein because you need to start repairing and rebuilding and supporting your immune system as well through that process because everything's going to have taken a hit during those intense efforts. So you want to make sure that you're getting in at least 20 to 30 grams of carbs and 20 to 30 grams of protein within roughly an hour post-workout to really help you absorb and take in the nutrition that you're actively trying to use to support you in a recovery space. Now, why you also need carbohydrates, because I get this question quite often. Usually we know we need protein afterwards, we know how that will support us, but we sometimes forget that we actually still need carbohydrates even after we fueled during the workout, even after we fueled beforehand. And the reason why is because those carbs are going to help you to restore your glycogen or those carbohydrate stores that you have in your body. When that's depleted and when your body's depleted of energy, priority number one is always going to be refilling that tank and giving your body energy to continue moving. So if you only take in protein post-workout, what's going to end up happening is that protein is going to get turned into carbohydrate instead. And as a result, it's not going to be used in the amounts that we want it to be used to repair and rebuild your muscles and tissues. So we want to make sure that we're getting in some carbs to support that rebuilding process. Again, the live steady carbohydrate, if you remember back to that graph, is going to give you that steady energy to help you repair and to help you sort of rebuild that glycogen tank. But the protein piece can then go to what it needs to do, which is repair and recover. So you want to make sure you're getting in both. And then last, but certainly not least, before we get to any questions that you might have in the chat, I want to talk through some of the questions that we get asked most often. The first, what is the starch made of? It's going to be coming from corn. Now, as I mentioned, it's processed in a very specific manner that is patented that allows it to behave differently when it enters the system. What does UCAN taste like? So this is a really interesting one, and it's one that I talk about a lot because I think we've all gotten pretty used to. If you've been in the endurance space for a while, you know what traditional gels taste like, you know what textures you're looking out for, and they don't sort of seem different to you, right? They don't seem like weird or like you shouldn't be consuming them. I remember the first time I had a gel and I was like, what is this? Right? But then you get used to it. The first time, it's always like, this is a little different. The same can be said for UCAN. Because it is a starch, it does have a different taste and consistency. Now, by taste, I mean it's a bit more neutral. So it's not overpoweringly sweet. It doesn't sort of coat the teeth in the way that traditional gels might from the sugars. And it doesn't have as much of that sort of like gnawing aftertaste where you feel like you need some water. So from that perspective, it can also be really advantageous. But on the color side too, it's not going to be clear. It's almost like a white color. And aside from like the chocolatey flavors, it's gonna be a more white color. So when you look at it, don't be alarmed if you see that. That is the starch, and it should be that way. And as a result, the first few times you have it, I always say just have it a couple times first to really then build up like, how do I actually feel about this? Because the first time that you try it, just be like, oh, that's different, right? It's different to what you might have had before. If it's your first time having a gel, you're going to also think it's different. So either way, give it a few tries before you really make a decision on what flavors you like, how you feel about the texture. It's also going to be a little bit more liquidy, which a lot of people can really enjoy. I always like to just point out though that this is not replacing any fluids you take in. UCAN is a more liquidy gel, which can be really nice when you're running for a really long period of time and you want something that won't dry out the mouth as much, but you still need fluids, not only from a digestion standpoint, but obviously also, as we talked about, from just an overall what you've lost in your sweat perspective as well, and making sure you're maintaining fluid balance. So make sure you're continuing to get in water alongside any gels that you take too. Then will I need any additional electrolytes with UCAN's new energy gel plus electrolytes? This is a question we've only been getting recently because the new gel is a very new addition to the UCAN lineup. Now, the answer is it depends. It depends on what your specific needs are. For most people, if you're doing 2 to 3 UCAN gels an hour and they're all going to be that energy gel plus electrolytes, likely you won't need much more than water. But again, if your sweat rate is higher, if you lose more salt in your sweat, you may need some more electrolytes to go alongside that. So you just want to ensure that whatever gel you're using, if it has electrolytes, or if you know sort of roughly where you need to sit electrolyte wise, you compare it to how often you're having this new gel that has electrolytes in it, 200 milligrams of sodium per gel. And you see, okay, if I'm having 2 of these an hour and I need 400 milligrams per hour, that's going to be exactly on target for me. So again, it's individualized and it just depends on your specific needs in the space. And then how often should you take UCAN in comparison to traditional gels? So this will also vary by person. Based on the science, you can take it a little less frequently because it will give you more steady energy without the high, high and the low, low, and it will support you for a longer period. You can pull from it for longer while you're also pulling from glycogen and from your fat stores. However, if you are someone who wants to make sure you have more available fuel on hand, you're more than welcome to fuel with it in a similar fashion to whatever gel you used before, if that's every 30 minutes or every 20 minutes. It ultimately depends on your specific preferences and what your GI can tolerate. As I mentioned, UCAN does pass through the stomach faster, so it doesn't have that same risk that traditional gels have where they sit in the stomach a little bit longer, and that can cause fermentation and lead to some GI distress. So you may be able to sort of stack up a little bit more UCAN more often, say every 20 minutes if you want to, and get you closer to 60 grams per hour if that's your goal, or even higher if you have a higher goal than that. So again, it depends, but ideally, you shouldn't need quite as much because of the fact that it's going to be more steady energy and more stable energy for you for longer. How often should I take the UCAN Energy Gel plus caffeine? So the first thing to note about caffeine is, are you sensitive to it? If you are sensitive to caffeine, you may want to take a lower dose less often. If you are someone who takes copious amounts of coffee throughout the day and is unaffected by caffeine, this may be something that we can sort of add into your strategy a little bit more often at a higher dose. Now, at a baseline, caffeine is going to peak about 2 hours in. So when you're exercising, about 2 hours in, it comes up and then it starts to go down. So if you're taking a larger dose, say like a UCAN Energy Gel can have close to 75 milligrams of caffeine, which will be similar to a cup of coffee, that will peak about halfway in to a, say, 4-hour marathon. And then you might want another one, right, to get you to the finish line. So you don't see that caffeine coming down. You want to be able to push all the way through the finish line as well. So that would be my recommendation, is sort of like at the start of a race and then halfway through, depending on your specific tolerance of caffeine. If you're someone who is a little more sensitive, you can go with a lower dose and just do it more often so that you get little drips of caffeine along the way rather than a bigger hit all at once. But always try it in training first, both in a an intense sort of more tempo track-based workout as well as that long easy run because again you just want to make sure you tolerate it in both scenarios. Caffeine does move things through a little bit faster, so that's mainly why we just want to assess the risk for you and see how it sits in your system. And then lastly, how often should I take the UCAN energy gel plus electrolytes? So I sort of alluded to this in the question about if you'd need additional electrolytes with that gel. It's going to come down to your specific needs and preferences. If you're not sweating as much, if you're, not doing something super intense, maybe you pair this with the original line and you do every other one to give you closer to, if you're doing every 30 minutes, maybe you just need 200 milligrams an hour during a less intense effort. But if you're someone who's a heavy, salty sweater, you may want them more often, and you may want to try and consider including them more often in your intake to support you from the electrolyte side as well. The options are endless, and I think that's the beauty of the UCAN lineup is that you can really mix and match it to your specific needs and preferences. And with that, Varun, I want to pass it back over to you. I'm sure there's some questions that we've gotten in the chat, or maybe questions that come in live, or maybe other questions that you've just thought of. So I want to turn it back over to you, and I will stand by.
Wonderful, Charlotte. Just an amazing, amazing wealth of information. So really, really appreciate that. And always great to hear you talk through the different products. Definitely picked up some tips. Yeah, we you addressed this a little bit, but I think sort of one of the fundamental questions is like we hear so much about dosing and timing and high carb fueling and recommendations around 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour, which has kind of been like maybe the trusted standard in endurance sports for many years. But now we're talking about 100 grams of carbs plus per hour. So
Yeah.
can you maybe just kind of share some of your context around that conversation and how does it apply to UCAN? Because people kind of might look at UCAN and think that the recommendations are, quote, lower carb than what they're
Yep.
used to hearing.
Yep, great question. So I think it all comes back actually to the way that UCAN supercarb works, right? In that one, it doesn't produce that same sort of insulin spike, but two, it doesn't, as a result, cause that high high and that low low that you're trying to chase away. So your reliance on carbohydrate isn't quite as high. So you can fuel with UCAN at 60 grams an hour, and it can behave similar to someone fueling with traditional carbohydrates at 100 grams an hour, which I think from a science perspective is awesome, right? Because when you think about how it's actually functioning at a metabolic level, it's not that anyone is saying that, UCAN is low carb or this, this is a better option than that one. It's just saying that from a metabolic level, UCAN allows you to fuel with less more efficiently. And it also allows you to be more efficient with the other forms of energy that you have on board, like fat, which is another great thing that you can pull from, but you don't want to be only relying on fat, which is why when someone starts fueling with the more traditional gels that contain glucose and fructose, remember, insulin's going to cut off sort of your ability to pull from fat as much. So as a result, you're more reliant on the carbs that you take in. And you see the high, high and the low, low, and how quickly it happened, right, in that graph. And so as a result, you might be fueling every 15, 20 minutes to keep the engine going, right? And one, that can be very stressful on race day, right? When you're trying to like prevent the high, high and the low, low. But two, it also increases your risk of GI distress because of how those carbohydrates are going to sit in the stomach, unlike UCAN, which passes through and then is more steady. So from a UCAN to traditional gel perspective, UCAN allows you to fuel with less, but it's simply because of how it's functioning at a metabolic level, not because the carbohydrate, or the company wants you to take in less. It's just how it's working, which I think is an awesome context to give to the product itself and how it can be used in your day-to-day training. And the people who are taking in closer to 100 or maybe 120 grams on usually running wise, it's usually like 100 is like that cap for a lot of people because of the GI distress. On the bike, sometimes people can get in more than that because there's not as much pounding on the GI. But that can be a lot of extra work for the GI to have to move through. And again, you're going through this roller coaster, right? Or you're trying to prevent the roller coaster as you're either running or you're riding. And that can put more stress on the body than you'd actually want to put on the body. And so as a result, this product can actually support you in a multitude of ways, not only from a performance aspect, but when we actually think about health as a whole and that concept, it puts less stress on your body because now you're pulling from multiple sources. And then it also ensures that you're not overproducing insulin the whole time that you're exercising to try to compensate for the high highs and the low lows throughout the effort as well.
It's great, great perspective. And I think even what you talked about at the start, with blood sugar, and the impact of blood sugar on energy, I guess that's a lot, as well, right? That ties into the fact that if UCAN is fundamentally keeping your blood sugar stable and you're not having these fluctuations, then you're not needing to kind of continuously dose with carbs
Exactly.
to elevate that blood sugar. So that's a great question, that somebody had in the audience, and I know it comes up a lot. Or sorry, I should say that's a great answer. The question was
No,
funny as well,
the
but
question was great. I mean, I
it's
thought
a
the
great
question was
question as
awesome.
well.
Yeah.
But no, that was a great response. Yeah, that was mostly you covered a lot of the other stuff that came in the chat, but that was one that I just wanted to lean in on a little bit more. But Charlotte, with that, anything else that you want to kind of close with or emphasize? We talked through a lot of the kind of fundamentals of nutrition and the different ways to use the different UCAN products, how to combine them, kind of the differences between the new gels. So great recap of all of that. Anything you feel like, you just want to reinforce or that we didn't touch on?
Yeah, I think before I even get to sort of my closeout statement, I want to ask you what your thoughts are on the new Gel Plus electrolytes, because I know we've talked about it a ton. And I like, I mean, I think it's incredible, but I would just love to hear a little bit from you too, because I know we've chatted through like a few different ways that we like to consume it. And I think for the audience to hear your tip specifically about sort of how you store it before you use it would be a
Absolutely.
great one because it's something that now I do and I'm like, oh my gosh, in the summer, this is going to be a game changer.
Yeah, no doubt. I've always liked to store my UCAN gels in the fridge just because they taste really good. But with the new electrolyte gels, so I was at a training group for the Boston Marathon training a couple weekends ago, and it was pretty cold here in Boston, and they were in my car overnight, and I showed up at the group and was sampling the new electrolyte gels, and they were nice and cold, and people were just loving it. I think that kind of salty, like I said, like that's pretty much my go-to for all the UCAN gels, and it's really, really nice, goes down really smooth and easy, and you kind of have that cold liquidy taste hit your mouth while you're running. It feels really good, but especially that cold taste with the saltiness of the electrolyte gels, I feel like it was just A
Game
plus plus.
changer.
So
Yeah.
highly recommended. I've even had some triathletes tell me, this was prior to the electrolyte gels, but just with UCAN in general, that they would freeze their gels, especially some of the ones that they'd be taking
Yep.
later on in the race, because by the time it's been 4, 5, 6 hours, that frozen gel is melted and still,
Yep.
nice and cool. So yeah, freezing the gels, but really more importantly, refrigerating the gels. You don't have to do it, but really, really makes them nice and delicious.
Yeah, 100%. It's something I'm definitely going to take with me to Keys for sure. And I'm going to literally think about this conversation every time I do it. I think the last thing just to say about UCAN as a whole and the product and how it can work for athletes, it's such a special product. And, every time I go back through the research on it, it just like puts me in awe every single time because it really functions so incredibly well, obviously for its first intended audience, which was glycogen storage disease, but now sort of in all of these other audiences too, including endurance athletes. And for me, it's been a game changer in my performance in terms of how I feel and how much I can push and how hard I can push. And I owe that to one, the way that it keeps my blood sugar steady and stable, but also the way that it allows me to pull from multiple sources of fuel as I'm exercising to push harder for longer with that steady and stable energy along the way. So I think it's an awesome product and an incredible product. And I also love the science behind it. And I would encourage you all to just do a deep dive into it because it's super cool. Again, if you're a nutrition nerd like me, and it's something that I think really puts the product into a league of its own as a result.
Amazing, Charlotte. Well, yeah, we really appreciate your perspective as a nutrition nerd. No shame in that. That's something to be
No,
proud
I
of.
own it. I own it.
Also as an endurance athlete and somebody who lives and breathes this stuff, it's really, really great to hear your perspective and all your tips. But yeah, really appreciate your time today. Thanks to everybody, for joining us. And if you are listening to this, as a recording later on, you've really, probably gained a lot from what Charlotte has to say. But feel free to reach out to us, via social media, via the UCAN helpline, and we'll be happy to give you guys, any additional info you need. You'll also be getting this recording sent to you a little bit later this evening. Charlotte, thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate your
you.
time.